Right. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from in the world. Welcome to Crazy Talk. For those of you who are watching Crazy Talk for the first time, Crazy Talk is a Facebook Live TV show, podcast thing where I interview all sorts of people with all sorts of experiences with mental health. And I'm your host, Lee Thomas. If this is not your first time watching Crazy Talk, thank you so much for coming back. We're really excited to have you. We love those returning viewers, and we love the folks who are watching the replay as well. So in this show, thank you so much for joining us. I'm really excited about our guest today. So our guest today is Francesco Granieri, who is a 40-year-old Italian-American from Atlantic City, New Jersey. He's an Emmy Award-winning graphics interface coordinator with ESPN, ABC, and a former teacher in the New Jersey public school system. He's written a book called Pavarotti and Pancakes. It's his first full-length book. Committed to slinging as much mud as possible, Francesco hopes to carve out a home for himself on the world stage in 3 languages. He's a musician and actor who longs to be an inspiration and source of motivation to his readers. And I think once we talk about this book a little bit, you guys will totally agree that he is very much. After years of living within the framework of a painfully dysfunctional home, Francesco has determined that what he spent so long attempting from was instead a challenge to be overcome. In the writing of Pavarotti and Pancakes, he has realized that the sharing of his story and ultimately his triumph could be of benefit to others who have been adversity. So thank you so much, Francesco, for joining us. Really, really glad to have you on the show. Welcome.
Good morning, Lee. How are you?
So for those of you who have watched Crazy Talk a number of times, you'll know that my first question is always kind of a why question. And that's the question that I have for you as well today, Francesco, is, a lot of people have difficult stories. Lots of people have stuff that they've overcome, and they don't necessarily go on to share that story to inspire and motivate others. So what motivated you to share your story in such a public way?
Sure. So it was April of 1999. I was a student studying abroad. I was in Buenos Aires, Argentina. And on a whim, a friend of mine in Argentina said, "Hey, Luciano Pavarotti is giving a concert. Why don't we go to the concert?" And I thought, okay, whatever. I wasn't particularly motivated, but I accepted the invitation. Now, I should say that the title of my book, Pavarotti and Pancakes, my father was a classically trained opera singer, or I guess you would say he studied bel canto. So I grew up with Pavarotti's music to an extent. Anyway, at the concert, they first had an Argentine opera singer perform, and it was interesting. And then the second half, Pavarotti came out. And Lee, I'm telling you, as he sang the different arias, I was reminded of my childhood. Again, the title Pavarotti and Pancakes. We would have breakfast on Sunday mornings, eating pancakes, listening to Pavarotti, Frank Sinatra, Julio Iglesias, people like that. But to get to your question, when Pavarotti sang the song O Sole Mio, which most people are familiar with, I had hair back then. Literally, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I leaned forward in my seat, and I was transported back to the Jersey Shore. I grew up in New Jersey, and something happened to me, and I realized I was meant to write a book, and the book was going to be about my mother. My mother was sexually abused as a child by 3 different men, if you can imagine that, 3 different men that she trusted. She was also verbally abused by her father for many, many years, and that left a huge imprint on her and affected her tremendously by the time I met her when she was an adult. And there was such an unfairness about that she was an innocent child, that between that and the inspiration I got from Pavarotti, I thought, you know what? I got to write her story. I have to tell the world about what I call the little girl in the greenhouse. That's where most of the abuse took place, in this greenhouse behind her friend's home, where that person's grandfather took advantage of her. So that's where the inspiration came from. I wanted to tell this story, this little girl who became my mother. And thanks to Pavarotti, it was a 19-year journey. It took me 19 years to write the book, but it just came out in the spring, and I'm very excited about it.
Yeah, and it sounds like a very difficult story, a very compelling story, absolutely, and a very important story. But was it, I guess, emotionally difficult for you to write it? Like, because I know you've talked about how it was, it felt like something that you had to do and something that you were born to do. But was it still a very difficult process for you?
So it took me 19 years. It took me 23 drafts. The first two drafts, I kid you not, I cried through most of the drafts. I'm not ashamed to say that. It was very cathartic, very therapeutic to put down on paper all of the tragedies that not only my mother experienced as a child, but that then bled over into my childhood and my adolescence. The remaining 21 drafts were not quite as emotional; they were more mechanical and trying to work out a story that people could actually take something from, maybe even some level of entertainment. Just kind of say that with an asterisk. Um, but it was a challenge. Sure, I mean, 19 years, 23 drafts, three different editors. It was a project that I could not stop. I was compelled to get this done.
And I think that's something that a lot of, I mean, I can only really speak for myself, right, in terms of my own experience. I definitely found that sharing my story was a very important part of my own recovery, even though it was very difficult for me. So sharing my story was something that I felt a lot of ambivalence and a lot of stigma and a lot of shame about. But when I realized I could help other people, that was the turning point for me. Like that was the turning point of like, oh, I went through all this, for a reason, I guess. Maybe that's not the perfect phrasing, but it's like the fact that I've suffered doesn't have to end with me. Like I can help other people through it. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And the phrase that I sort of carried around was, I wanted to take the worst thing that happened to me, which was I lost my mother to mental illness. She was eventually institutionalized. So I wanted to take the worst thing that happened to me and turn it into the best thing that happened to me. And I was going to be that alchemist. I was going to be that one to take that tragedy and turn it into a triumph. And that was really what I wanted to do with Pavarotti and Pancakes. And as you touched upon, if anybody could take anything away from my humble writings, that made it even that much more compelling for me to try to finish the project and ultimately bring the book to print.
Mm-hmm. Wow. And so I guess even in terms of we've talked a little bit about emotionally, but in terms of like practicality, writing a book is no small undertaking, right? Like you
Right.
talked about 23, that's draining.
So the inspiration came to me on April 23rd, 1999, and I couldn't go to sleep after the concert ended. I walked around Buenos Aires, which is a beautiful metropolitan city in South America. It's called the Paris of South America. And I was just learning Spanish then, and I was talking out loud to myself in Spanish about trying to figure out what was Pavarotti saying to me. And I realized I was meant to write this book. So you're right, the practicality of it. I was at that point, I was not a college graduate. I ended up dropping out of college twice. It took me 7.5 years to finish college. So to think that that guy's going to write a book, it's not normally the way it works. But I realized if you set a goal, which is I wanted to have, here was my first goal, not to bore you with the details, but I said to myself, in 8 months, I want to have 280 double-spaced pages. Now, I had nothing. In 8.5 months, I had 282 double-spaced pages. My story, the first draft was flushed out. Now, what I did, I interviewed friends and family, interviewed my brothers, my father, interviewed my mother, interviewed relatives to get all of the information, all the details to write as comprehensive a memoir as I could. Of course, I'm the narrator, so my memories and feelings lead the way. But I read memoirs. That's really what began the process. I didn't even know what a memoir was, to be honest with you. But once I read a few memoirs, I said, "Oh, that's what I want to do. I want to tell my story in that kind of framework." So I just didn't quit. That was the other element. I should say I tried to get published traditionally, but I received 893 rejections from different literary agents and publishing houses. So I finally decided to publish on my own. It's the best thing that I could have done.
Yeah. And I have this whole process, but I think specifically with interviewing, because especially when it comes to a story, about relationships and about, in my experience, like about mental illness and the way that impacts my relationships. When you were doing these interviews, any resistance, I guess? Were there people who you wanted to interview who were like, Francesco, I don't think we should be telling this story?
So I come from an Italian-American family, and I guess you would say traditionally, we're not a very public community. When there is drama, when there is trauma, it tends to be kept behind closed doors. So I experienced a little bit of that from some relatives, but after I told them how important it was to me that the world knew my mother's story, then they let their guard down, and they provided me with the tidbits of information and detail that I was looking for. So I should say also, I changed everyone's name except for my immediate family. It wasn't fair, in my estimation, to bring other people into a world that maybe they didn't want their names and characteristics out there. So I thought that was the right thing to do.
Yeah. And that's just like, I just think it's so fascinating. Have to overcome this vulnerability, because it's something that I've, done so much work in. Because when you admit that things, aren't perfect, even when you admit that there's like, that maybe something isn't going as well as it could, or you admit that someone is struggling or whatever it might be, it takes vulnerability, right? And that takes bravery. And a lot of the times people put up those walls, right, where they just go, we don't talk about this, and then nothing gets fixed.
I agree. I agree that the walls are a problem. I understand why they're there. My mother had a fortress of walls to keep outsiders and even family members from really knowing what was the shame that she sort of kept hidden. And maybe because I saw that firsthand, I went the opposite direction. I believe in therapy. I believe in discussion. I believe in getting what's inside out as a curative process. I did 1 year of therapy with this wonderfully talented male psychoanalyst, and then I did 8 years with an exquisitely talented female doctor in New Jersey. I would go 40 times a year. There's 52 weeks in a year. I hardly missed except for holidays and stuff like that. I think that was part of my mother's struggle. She never consistently went to a mental health professional, and she sort of rebelled against sharing her feelings, and that kind of kept her locked. Where I thought, no, the key to unlocking this is talking about it. And that's really where my book also came from.
And do you think, I'd love to like kind of talk about this idea of getting help, because I think I can probably relate a bit to your mom's resistance, right? Like they can probably relate. I mean, I'm from like rough and tumble northern Alberta, and so the idea of being kind of resistant to getting help. And I think, with you, there's probably this additional layer of, there's kind of these gender roles that are sometimes at play, right? Where there's this idea that like men aren't allowed to get help. Is that something that you came across?
You're going to find this an interesting response to this question.
Oh, sorry. Our internet is not being great. Sorry.
Okay. No, I heard you. I heard
So,
your question fine. Are you hearing me clearly?
yeah.
Okay. So what I was going to say was, you're right. My mother, who should have been talking to some professionals in the mental health field back in the 60s and 70s, that was just not a possibility. Her family were immigrants from Italy. That was just not something that community thought of doing back then. But in terms of me in the late 90s, early 2000s, being from New Jersey, I'm sure you've heard of the TV show The Sopranos.
Yes.
And if you remember, the lead character, Tony Soprano, what did he do? He went and saw a psychiatrist. And that was shocking for me as a man to say, hold on, this big, burly, macho man is going and talking about his feelings. And I'm not saying that it played a huge role in why I decided that therapy was something that I was going to invest in, both with my time and capital. But I hope that the feeling has changed slightly in terms of, oh, men can't do that. You're not a real man if you go and talk about your feelings. I think that's nonsense. I think that it's important to get out what's inside rather than have it eat you up.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's one of those things where I love that you brought up The Sopranos, which like is a show that like I'm like tangential, but I wouldn't be able to like, you know, quote any episodes for you. But this idea of media representation kind of paving the way for possibility. You know what I mean? Like the idea that you saw someone who you felt, you know, was kind of a possibility model for you, someone who was saying it's okay to do this. And so in terms of, I guess, you're creating, you know, like by writing a book, you're creating the media that, you know, maybe we needed when we were younger. Is there any other media out there that you think is doing kind of the mental health piece really right, or any media that you're thinking is doing the mental health piece really wrong? I'm happy to hear either or both.
Well, I should say that I, in a literal sense, derived much inspiration from Angela's Ashes, which was a wonderful memoir written by an Irish writer named Frank McCourt. And he allowed me to realize how vulnerable and deep a writer can go in talking about, in his case, his father's drinking and how that affected his family. And also, I believe the title is A Glass Castle or The Glass Castle. I'm not sure which it is, but by Jeanette Walls. That was also something that really helped me. Again, another family-based story where she didn't leave any of the gory details out. So I felt like they were a window into something similar to my family. And I wanted to share that with people in terms of the shame isn't something to be ashamed of. The shame is something to be discussed. Now, the second half of your question, do I think there's another platform that is covering that? To be honest with you, I'm not sure outside of The Sopranos if I can think of another show or movie that hit me and inspired me to believe in the benefits of therapy quite as heavily as those books I mentioned and The Sopranos.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where when it's not something that you talk about, whether and I think this is true of any topic, whether that topic is shame or that topic is therapy, is, you know, whatever it is, when you don't talk about it, it becomes almost something scary to talk about. You know what I mean? We really pick up on don't talk about. We're very acutely aware of, because like even, you know, growing up in Northern Alberta where no one talked about mental health, no one sat me down and said, hey, we don't talk. It was just understood that we didn't talk about it, right? And so by breaking that silence, it just goes, this is something we talk about.
It's funny you just used the phrase break the silence. On the back of my book, on the back cover, I have in big bold letters, break the silence and end child abuse, in the sense that even today, unfortunately, I think that children are taken advantage of, and either they don't have the voice to speak up, or they do tell someone they trust, and that person then swallows it and doesn't do anything with that information, and the abuse is allowed to continue. And that's also for when abuse has already occurred years down the line. Don't be afraid to talk about it. It's it needs to be discussed. It really does, I think. Otherwise, it's like an emotional cancer that just eats you up.
Yeah, and it definitely, I think this kind of ties in really, really nicely with a lot of stuff that's going on in the world right now. Like, we talked a little bit about backstage, we talked a little bit about the Me Too movement and how that's, just, it's an opportunity for people to share their stories, right? And that opportunity just historically hasn't really been there.
Right. Our society wasn't open to hearing about anyone's misfortunes in a personal and private and intimate way. It didn't seem like there was any room in the landscape for that. Now, of course, in my sense, it's my mother's child abuse and then all of the drama that my family went through dealing with her, what I would call mental collapse. Even that, it's sort of new that you can openly discuss those sorts of struggles. But the Me Too movement, of course, it's brought out the sexual side of abuse and the power that men seem to have taken advantage of over the years that wasn't talked about, and now it's being discussed.
Yeah. And it's so important to have these discussions, and it's really fabulous that people are overcoming and recognizing that this isn't something that I have to be ashamed of. Like, it's it's not my fault. It's all of these things, and I think that that's just really fantastic. So if you were, I guess, in a position to be giving advice to someone who maybe has a loved one who's struggling with their mental health, or who they themselves might be struggling with their mental health, do you have would share with them?
So the first example, if a loved one is struggling with mental health, the first thing I would say is for you to go get some mental health counseling. And that might be a way for you to help your loved one. In my sense, or in my experience, I should say, my mother rebelled against professional help. And I was only a young man and a teenager. But if I had been armed with the proper skills by going to a mental health professional then, I may have been better coped or better able to cope with my mother at that time in my life. So I guess I would say is, again, if someone you know and love is struggling with their own mental health issues, to go get your own counseling. And if you yourself are struggling, take a deep breath, reach out to someone you trust and try to sit down with them and maybe try to find whom can help you in the mental health world. I can't say enough about how much counseling really helped me, without a doubt.
Oh, and that's fabulous. And I'm so glad that you've had that really positive experience. I honestly can't believe it by so quickly. It's been so wonderful chatting with you, but we're right near the end of our time. So for the folks who are watching who are going, man, Francesco has this all figured out. Like, he want to read his book. I want to learn more about him. I want to, get in contact with him. How can people do that?
Sure. First, the book is available on Amazon.com in paperback. It's also available on Kindle and Nook. Again, the title is Pavarotti and Pancakes. And if you'd like to reach out to me, my name is Francesco Granieri. So my website is francescogranieri.net. francescogranieri.net. And I would love to converse with whomever about their stories, or more in depth about my story, or whatever you feel like is something you want to share.
I'll definitely put links to those in the comments below. So if for anyone who's catching the replay, we'll put the links to the comments below about 5 minutes after the show ends. Other than that, thank you so much, Francesco, for joining us on the show, for sharing your story, for writing the book, for getting the conversation started for so many people. I know it's really going to help a lot of people, and I think what you're doing is just absolutely fantastic. So I really appreciate you taking the time out of your Saturday to be on the show and share a little bit with us. So thank you so much for that. For those of you who are watching this and going, wow, Crazy Talk is so much fun. I want to have episodes of Crazy Talk directly to my inbox. You can get episodes of Crazy Talk directly to your inbox by signing up for my mailing list. I will put a link to the mailing list in the comments below, but you can all list by going to leethomas.ca, and a little pop-up will come up and you can enter your email and then you will be on the mailing list. So thank you all so much for tuning in. Thank you again, Francesco, for being on the show. And I will catch all of you next time at 12:30 Atlantic on next. So thanks so much, and